workshop was originally conceived as just talking about the Green New Deal. Basically, it started out as a campaign platform, when I was familiar with it anyway, a campaign platform in 2012 for Jill Stein. It eventually was adopted by the Green Party as a whole, so it went before the National Committee. They voted to endorse it as a Green Party position. So what I'm talking about is not just a campaign position, but a Green Party position. So in a way, okay, that's you can say who believes in the Green New Deal, Green Party. Several things have happened since then, and there are other elements of party platforms that have been developed. One was used by Howie Hawkins in his 2014 gubernatorial race. So Gloria Mattera here, my co-presenter, is going to tell you about that. And then there are a couple of other things that I probably will mention. One is that in this year, the Jill Stein campaign, for better or worse, has changed the definition of the Green New Deal to be a more narrower program, and the broader program they call the Power to the People plan. So I'm just going to try to sort of put that in perspective. And then if we have time, I'll talk about one more platform that was used in Massachusetts last year called the Community Uplift Initiative. It's not a complete platform, but it's maybe very important. So in all these cases, we're talking about what I call a campaign platform, which means when your candidate is asked, what do you stand for, or what actually would you do, they pull this out. And so it's a little more, much more focused than just the general party platform, which is very long, not kept up to date very much, may not be specific to your state. It's hard to just point to the Green Party platform and say, there, that's what I'm about. You need something that's a little more topical, a little more current, uses the right language for the moment. So these platforms we're talking about are really focused. They are focused on priority issues, for one thing, not every issue, but priority issues. And they deliver the campaign's message. If whatever your message is, your platform, it has to come out very clearly in your platform message. It's not just a long list of every possible subject and your position on it. It's more focused. And the goal is to win voter support for the candidate, not to win support for the document. And it's easy for people to sort of get really wrapped up in the document and making it longer and longer and more detailed with more and more argument. But you know, it's not that we're saying, here's a wonderful document, so vote for me, but we're trying to get them interested in the candidate's positions. So we're talking about things that are useful in a campaign, not just good reading material for you. And it has to be useful to the candidate when they speak. The language, the points it raises, need to be something the candidate can use. So the Green New Deal in 2012, basically it came about because we needed in 2012 to have a campaign platform. Green New Deal term has been used before. It's been used, I think it was used by Howie Hawkins, as Gloria may say, in New York. It was used by the Green parties in Europe, the term Green New Deal. And so this is just its own thing. It's not specifically related to those other earlier versions. And a lot of people make a lot of the name, but the name is just meant to imply that this is a fairly broad policy statement. It's not like here are 6 reforms we'll make when we get to Washington. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is like talking about a new way of doing business, and that was kind of what the term New Deal that took hold in the Franklin Roosevelt administration was, a new way of doing business, a new way of looking at how government related to the people. And so what we're talking about here is another new way. We call it the Green New Deal. It had 4 parts. The first part was the Economic Bill of Rights, which I'll talk about. I'll talk about each of these a little later in detail, a little more detail. A Green Transition, which is our environmental platform. Real Financial Reform, which talked about financial power. Remember in 2012, the Wall Street crash and the bailouts and all of that was really high on everybody's mind, so that became a separate part of this platform. I'll say maybe in 2016, this is not necessarily, shouldn't be elevated to a level of being one of the 3, but back then it made sense. And a functioning democracy, and this is about how political power is organized. So let me just briefly go through these. And most of this material, actually, I think it's still available online, so you can get the full document if you want to read it. I'm just pulling out here the more important things that I think were really, really key to it. The first one is the Economic Bill of Rights, which says that all persons have the right to adequate employment, health care, education, housing, and utilities. And the Economic Bill of Rights was actually introduced by Franklin Roosevelt in, I believe it was in his second administration. He said, you know, we've got the New Deal is out there, he said, but we really need an Economic Bill of Rights that says that people have economic rights, not just, you know, people really, our government should guarantee that they have these basic things they need to be free of desperate economic circumstances. And it's sort of a very, you know, some words here seem like simple words, but they're very important. All. Not some people. That stimulates the economy, so a few more people will get jobs, but then too bad that, you know, if a number of people fall through the cracks. This says all, and that's very important. And our policy here is to in terms of jobs, is to guarantee a job to every person who's able and willing to work. That's what we mean by full employment. So this is not just stimulating job creation. You know, the Democrats and Republicans have these, oh, we care about jobs, so what are we going to do? Well, here's a stimulus program. I'm going to give this money to my rich friend here who will try to figure out how to make himself richer. And in doing so, he will fund some business, and that business will have to hire more people. And then, you know, as they're hiring, you know, they may then run out of people and have to go down and actually find some poor unemployed person to hire. So therefore, by giving money to my rich friend, you know, I'm stimulating the economy and helping the poor. The old trickle-down theory you may have heard. But what we're talking is quite different. We're saying a job to every person, and that every is very important. It means that we don't just throw a little money into the economy and hope that a few jobs are created and maybe things get a little better for some people. Every person would guarantee a job to every person. So if we look at your community, find out that there are 10,000 unemployed people in your community, 10,000 people who want to work, can't find jobs, we would put the funds in and the programs in to provide 10,000 jobs, one for everybody. And if they can't find a job in the private sector, we would create public sector jobs, a sufficient number, so that we could get a job for everyone. So we would turn the unemployment offices into employment offices. You go in unemployed, you go out with the instructions for where to report for work, because you'll have a job. And there are all kinds of reasons why this totally changes the economy. It means that those communities where people are struggling, where you have high unemployment, where nothing ever seems to change, where people are standing out on the street corner with no means of real sustenance, it means that would all go away. We put the jobs where they're needed, and the fear of losing your job, the fear that you won't be able to pay your bills, you know, if you lose your job because you could be unemployed, that goes away. I mean, you may not have the job you really dream of, your dream job, but you know that if you're willing to work, all you've got to do is go down to the employment office, you know, fill out the forms to be tested, and you'll be told where to report for work. That changes the nature of the fear that's used today to make people who do have jobs afraid to challenge the system, afraid to strike, afraid to demand their employer to give them higher wages. All that, a lot of that is based on the fear that you'll be out of a job and you'll be in total economic ruin. And this policy of a job for everyone really changes that. It also means that it would be a tremendous boost to the economy as a whole, because suddenly there would be, we calculate about $800 billion in personal income flooding into the economy every year from this. People that formerly were sitting there unemployed and not knowing what they were going to do next would have a paycheck, and they'd go and spend it, and when they spend it, that makes the whole economy take off. Right now, we're losing that $800 billion. It's just like disappearing down a black hole every year. A person that could be, say, generating $40,000 worth of wealth, because work generates wealth, is generating nothing because they're unemployed. But if we could find a way to employ them, not only is that good for them, but it's good for the economy. It's a revolutionary impact. And the other thing that maybe I'll emphasize is that it's targeted to the people that need it. And right now, when the Obama administration writes these, they have something they call Quantitative Easy 3, which we might be able to talk about a little bit later. They give the money to the wealthiest Americans, and then they invest it supposedly and create jobs. Where do they invest it? They usually don't invest it in the communities that need jobs the most. And when a hedge fund manager gets his hands on an extra $50 million, how many of them run out to the inner city where the jobs are most needed and say, I'm going to put my $50 million here because the people need jobs? That's not the way hedge fund managers think. They think in terms of return on investment. Where can I put this $50 million to get the most profit from it? And they may put that $50 million into some community that already has a hot economy and is doing very well, or they may send it overseas. They may decide that, oh, I can sign an agreement with China to build a new facility, new factory in China in return for certain tax breaks and so on. So the money may just disappear out of the country. And that's the kind of economic stimulus we've been having for the past 20 years, and it just doesn't solve our problems. What this program does is it goes right where it's needed. So if your community needs 10,000 jobs, that's where the stimulus goes to create 10,000 jobs. A green transition, this is sort of the clean energy and environmental transition. I think we're pretty familiar with all of this. You notice one of the things we always start out with is green jobs, because the economy is number one in most people's minds. So when we want to sell the environment, we always have to start by talking about all the jobs we can create. Transition to small, locally based businesses and cooperatives. You've heard a lot of this in other workshops, people talking about these things. Transitioning to sustainable, non-toxic materials so that we don't poison ourselves while we're producing goods and services. And all the things that we know we really want to promote: organic agriculture, permaculture, sustainable forestry, making the economy sustainable. And of course, climate change is a big motivator here, and transitioning to renewable energy is very important to get a handle on climate change. Sustainability is also a key word. Our current economy is not sustainable. It's one of the problems we have. It exhausts resources. It builds up in an attempt to make the rich richer. We get everybody into debt, and then the debt causes the economy to collapse. And so what we're talking about is a sustainable economy that can be maintained for the foreseeable future. The financial reform, I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, but some of this stuff is still relevant. One thing is eliminating student debt. The Green New Deal doesn't just give the students a pretty good interest rate on their debt. We're talking about eliminating it. We don't want any more student debt. So part of this is tuition-free education all the way through colleges. Part of it is going back to the student debt that exists and having the government gradually take it over and eliminate it for the students who aren't able to pay back their debts. Because they shouldn't have those debts in the first place. That's what we believe. Nationalizing the Federal Reserve. Let's see. Public banks is part of this. If I have it up here. And the Glass-Steagall, if you're familiar with that term, it's restoring the separation of banks from the speculative investors, investment banks that speculate money and crash the economy. So there are several things there that are still relevant because the reforms that took place really aren't adequate, and the banks are mostly back to doing what they were doing before the economy crashed, so still relevant. And then finally, a real democracy, building a sustainable economy that's, that's not should be there. These are the points that should be there. So these are the things that we do to make sure we have a democracy. And in a way, a democracy is really really should be the foundation, because if we don't have a democracy, if all the policy decisions are being made by a few lobbyists representing the wealthiest 1/10 of 1% of the country, you're not going to get any of the other things that we want. All the policy decisions will go the wrong way. So we do need to make sure that people are being listened to. Revoke corporate personhood, universal right to vote, these various reforms like instant runoff voting, campaign financing, public campaign financing, And then finally, some of the things that are working against democracy today, like police militarization, Secure Communities Act, Patriot Act, FBI political suppression, which is still going on in many ways to undermine democracy. And those are things that we need to do to make sure we have the government is listening to the people, so that all the other reforms that we want can be undertaken. And finally, what I want to just mention is the way the twist this is taken now in the presidential campaign is the Stein campaign has kind of rewritten some of the things and expanded it. It's called the Power to the People plan. You can look this up online. There's a little more said. If you look here, it includes all the things that a lot of the things I just talked about. A few more details in some areas, but the problem is what confuses things is that now when they talk about the Green New Deal, it's basically the energy part of the Green New Deal of 2012. And I'm sorry I argued against this because I said it would be confusing, but I just don't want you to get confused. When you hear about the Power to the People plan, you should probably think, oh yeah, that's just like the new Green New Deal. It's like the 2012 Green New Deal, slightly reworded, a little bit of additional emphasis on some things. Justice, peace, etc. So it's pretty similar, but you'll notice it's probably a little better as a platform. It probably reads a little easier now, so you'll see that being used. So I'm going to turn it over to Gloria now, and she's going to tell us about the other Green New Deal, which is closely related, that Howie Hawkins used for his gubernatorial race.
Thanks, John. Great, everyone. So just to complement what John's talking about a little bit, and a lot of this work and these ideas obviously were borrowed from a lot of different sources, and then kind of put the kind of Green Party spin on it. And kind of going back, what was the Green New Deal? What was the New Deal about? Which was really this kind of massive jobs program in general, like public works. The government was able to kind of basically transition from wartime economy to peacetime economy and do the kinds of things that needed to be done. Some of us will say that that was the government's way of appeasing what was getting to be a pretty radical movement in terms of demanding jobs and healthcare and lots of other things. And some of the things that happened in the Green New Deal were improvements, but was it we ever really have, after just a short period of time, a massive job program we've been suffering with that for a long time. So in 2010, Howie Hawkins ran for governor. I was his lieutenant governor candidate then in New York State, and he started to talk about the Green New Deal as his party platform. It really kind of continued to develop. We talked about it obviously in New York State and what that would mean in New York State. And it was, then the Stein campaign in 2012, which I was fortunate to be a part of, really expanded that and kind of added to it and brought other things into it. I will say, in terms of the Economic Bill of Rights, is also in its entirety adopted in the Green Party platform, and that, even though Roosevelt talked about it, it actually, word for word, comes from the Labor Party here that was kind of in existence in the 90s under Tony Mazzocchi, and Howie and I were very active in that, and he was able to have that brought to the National Green Party and voted in. And so that talks about, as John said, what we're talking about is a right to organize, a safe work environment. I think what we also need to say is, we're talking about, when we talk about a $15 minimum wage, that is really just the beginning. What we're saying in the Economic Bill of Rights, it's about a living wage, right? I mean, we're working hard for 15. What I will say, in New York State, we work very closely, and we're endorsers of the 15 Now campaign. We think that we can do that. We can do that all across the country, depending on who we're going to elect, as opposed to inching up low-wage workers to $15 minimum an hour, several years from now. And in fact, we also advocate for cities to be able to set their own minimum, because we think in New York City it's really got to be $20. $15 is not really going to be enough. And as John said, covering all workers, right away. And so what we want to say is, when we talk about the Green New Deal, it's $15 minimum wage and guaranteeing a living wage is our goal, not to just kind of end it at $15. So we talked a lot about that in Cowie's 2014 campaign. We wanted to emphasize we need this now to lift people up so they can, live in an apartment, they can have food, they can do what they need to do, but that is really the bare bones, and that wouldn't be what a Green New Deal would talk about. We're not talking about bare bones for people. So I think that's, we've been kind of calling the Green New Deal, we say it's a planet saver and a job creator. In New York, we really feel like we don't want to emphasize one over the other. We do know that voters, people really are suffering because of the lack of jobs or good paying jobs, and so that is an emphasis that we feel is important when we're giving a campaign message. And Howie in 2014, I think did emphasize the job portion. It was kind of a jobs for all campaign. Some of us in New York, this is my, kind of personal opinion as chair there, is that we continue to say it has to be balanced. We have to continually address the climate crisis, and that the fact that this will quickly deal with the climate crisis, will mitigate the climate crisis, and provide millions of jobs. We've calculated through some studies, Mark Jacobson, and then the studies at Cornell, that in New York it would generate 4.5 million jobs, which is more than the amount of people currently that are out of work in New York. So, obviously we want to blow that up and say, what is that going to mean in everybody's area? As John said, we're looking at, the jobs will go in the areas where they need to have jobs, not where the corporations or businesses decide that's the most profitable for them. And I think it's really a dynamic program as long as we stay with the basics of the Green New Deal. And I like the way John kind of broke out the four kind of subcategories. I think that, people could use this. You want to say, well, if we're elected, when Greens are elected, we're going to enact the Green New Deal as one of our first things. And that's falling about, health care for all, the jobs for all, and lots of other things in there. But we also say, well, people are going to say, well, what are you working on now? So in New York, we've really adopted, as part of the Green New Deal, is this 100% clean renewable energy by 2030. What they're talking about in New York is they want to go 80% by 2050. That recent study, I think Jill cited it last night, that James Hansen talked about, the 80% by 2050 is just really too late. And that's just unacceptable. So we have been using that as a campaign. We have a petition drive about that. We actually have been lobbying in the state legislature about that. There's some interest in some other groups that are adopting that instead of the 80% 2050. So I guess if you're going back into your local areas, your local chapters, that might be a nice campaign to get people to talk about, and an introduction is something that we want to work on right now. To start getting parts of the Green New Deal out there. Also, the other thing that we've been concentrating on as part of the Green New Deal is the 15 Now campaign, and so pushing for that, raising the minimum wage immediately, so then we can start dealing with of people having a living wage. My feeling about the section about, I would have a little different spin on it. I think that the environmental part of it in the Green New Deal has to lead right away with the ending of use of fossil fuels, which we talk a lot now about New York, and how you will municipalize public power, have public power. We feel like just saying we're going to stop using fossil fuels and go 100% renewable energy is not really feasibly possible. From, wake up tomorrow, end all fossil fuel use, and then everything is ramped up by then, that there has to be a way to do that. And so the campaign is not saying this, but we are, we're talking about this in New York, and we're working with people to say how this happens. There is public power go around the country and how that's working, cooperatives and co-ops around those kinds of things. And we also, just kind of a little bit of a diversion, just how we're kind of spinning it in New York, is we're feeling, and we've had a lot of consultation with some of the few unions, particularly international unions, working with trade unions for energy democracy, that the use of green jobs, the term green jobs, has been so problematic, even for the most progressive unions that are involved in working on climate change. We know not all of them are. They may have a concern about it, but they continue to do this jobs versus climate mitigation, bad dichotomy, is that, we're finding other ways to talk about these jobs, that they're not necessarily green jobs, because that falls in terms of the energy sector in possibility of nuclear power, gas, hydraulic gas that is supposed to be this transition from fossil fuel, oil, coal, to renewables. And so we want to be very clear that that's not supported. So we're kind of searching for more ways to explain that to people in a better way. So that's covers New York.
I think if you search online, you can see a lot of this material is still, I think most of it is still available on one website or another. Find it. So let's see. Yeah, I think we have it till noontime, I believe, right? So I'll finish this presentation and then we'll have a general discussion. So this shouldn't take me more than about 15 minutes. I'm going to talk now about something called the Community Uplift Initiative, and this is not a complete, platform, but it became a very useful part of our platform in Massachusetts, and I think we're going to see it emerge as a national initiative. I think the Stein campaign's about to pick this up and go national with it. So I wanted to describe it, and I think it's potentially important part of the green platforms could be worked in. In 2008 in Massachusetts, our Governor Deval Patrick, he announced that he had a new bright idea for a new initiative. He called it the Life Sciences Initiative, but it soon became known as the Billion for Biotech program. And what he said was, we're going to put $1 billion of taxpayer money into the biotech industry, which is one of our leading industries, our high-flying sectors, and they're advancing, and they're opening factories, and they're doing all kinds of things, and they're such wonderful people that we're going to throw $1 billion at them to encourage them to expand in the state. The legislature rushed to, maybe appropriate. It's sort of, they approved it, and they have to dole the money out year by year, so it's not all appropriated all at once, but they approved it, and they've given away about 300 or 400 million so far. Meanwhile, while they were giving this money to the biotech industry, they were saying they were cutting education, healthcare, environmental protection, telling people, hey, there's just no money, budgets are tight, there's no money for you. And they were ignoring the high unemployment and distressed communities that receive almost no benefit from biotech. I analyzed this, and most of the biotech industry in Massachusetts, like 65% of it, is in the city of Cambridge, which is home to Harvard and MIT, and so they're a real high-tech city, and they have a great their average income there is well above the state average, and they were reaping a big chunk of this biotech money, and Boston also had some biotech, so they got a big chunk. And then when you went down to the cities in Massachusetts that were really having problems, where the unemployment was like 10, 12%, they had almost no biotech companies, so they weren't going to get anything. This was basically a big welfare program, a huge welfare program for the very wealthiest communities. And so what we said was, the Green Rainbow Party would do that differently. So we developed this program that was the alternative to the Billion for Biotech, and we called it the Community Uplift Initiative. And I'll say that the title for this was given to us by Mel King, if you know who he is. He's the first black man elected to the House of Representatives in Massachusetts. He created the Rainbow Coalition. You've heard of Jesse Jackson had the Rainbow Coalition, but he borrowed the name from Mel. He called Mel up at one point and said, "You got such a great name, Mel. Could I borrow it, for what I'm doing?" And Mel said, "Okay, sure." So Mel is good with names, and Mel said we should call this the Community Uplift Initiative, and that stuck. So it's an economic stimulus program for the rest of us. And what does it involve? Well, it addresses this, I think I've this is sort of like a joke, about backing up a little bit. That the problem with all of these stimulus programs is that they pour trillions of dollars into these stimulus programs, and they wind up enriching the rich and increasing inequality. They subsidize job-killing schemes like gambling casinos, automation, or moving jobs abroad. They bypass the communities that really need the help. They undermine democracy by letting the economic elite decide where the capital investment should be made, and the people have very little to say. And they undermine community by forcing communities in sort of a competition for the money doled out by the economic elite, so that if the company offers to spend $50 million to build a new chemical factory, and they want to put this right next to your water, the wetlands that provide you with your water, they then force the community to decide whether they want to have drinking water or do we want to have these jobs. It's a tough decision, and so the people who care about jobs will argue that to forget the environment, and environmentalists will argue to block the factory, and you get to fight over this very bad deal that's been offered to you because there's nothing else on the table. Well, what we're trying to do is we want to change that dynamic, and we want the money, the investment, to come from a democratically constituted organization, not from a bunch of venture capitalists or economic exploiters. And in terms of money, one program, the Obama administration's quantitative easing program, has spent over $3.5 trillion to prop up basically Wall Street and bondholders. And when I talk to people and say, are you familiar with the quantitative easing program? Even here, where you think people are following things, most people say, no, I never heard of that. What's that? Qualitative or what? It's quantitative easing. It's $3.5 trillion. And you say, well, surely my representative would have scrutinized that money in Congress, right, to see if it's taxpayer money is being well spent. Well, guess what? This was never approved by Congress. This did not go through Congress. When the wealthy and Wall Street wants a huge amount of money, they don't want to go through hearings where people can ask them questions. This was done in the Obama administration's Treasury Department just by bookkeeping, saying that we will buy $3.5 trillion and issue government securities, set down to your keyboard, and suddenly this money's flowing out without ever having a hearing or scrutiny of it relative to what their priorities are. So what we're saying is, this is the kind of thing that will not happen under a Green administration. We're going to end these things, but we're going to have something that's similar in size that we call the Community Uplift Initiative. And we will apportion money to communities basically on a per capita basis out of this, so that if you have, we may tinker with that a little bit, like it may be per capita of people whose income is less than the national average, but it's basically per capita. We'll ask those communities to form democratically governed commissions to make application for funds. And the commissions have to be not just appointed by the politicians, but they have to be shown that they're representing the people, the nonprofit communities, who knows, the churches, whatever they decide are the appropriate people to appoint people to this commission. And this commission will operate in a very open way. It will take applications for the money, look at them, and then it will pass them up, the ones it approves, to the federal level, where they get checked just to make sure there's nothing, no flaws in them, and approved. And the goals will be set. The goals have to be to address certain community needs like unemployment, poverty, environmental protection. And the results will be monitored to see if you're closing in on the goals. Are they really getting there? And so it's a democratically given way, democratically based way of making capital investment decisions. So that now if a company comes in and says, I'll invest, I want to build a chemical factory right next to your water supply. It may destroy your water supply, but so what? That's their application. They send their application in, fill in all it, and send it into the commission. And the commission has the $50 million. This is the point where we're trying to get to. The commission has the $50 million, not the company. So, anybody else, so the commission says, okay, we got one application here to destroy our water supply. Does anybody else have any applications? And that's where competition starts, because there are companies that will say, well, I can create more jobs than they're going to create, and I won't destroy your water supply. And here's my application. So now the commission looks and says, gee, these chemical guys, this is a lousy application. I mean, you did a terrible job. You don't get funded. goodbye. And they fund the business expansion that takes care of the community. So it's a totally different way of looking at the way the economy is run. And the company doesn't have the right anymore to say, well, if you don't let me destroy your water supply, I'll just locate my factory, just down the road in the other town. And that kind of blackmail that goes on now, the great job scam where they blackmail communities into destroying their environment in order to get the investment, that can't happen because the community has the money. So it's up to the corporation to please the community, not the other way around. So anyway, we do have some things here that we talk about where it has to be focused. When you send in this application and you set it up for approval, it has to show that it's targeting some of the things that the community really needs. So here are some of the things that we would be, you get extra points if your application deals with things like this. Things like weatherization to cut fuel costs for low-income housing units. I mean, there's a lot of money, a lot of jobs can be created just weatherizing every single apartment, every single house in the community. And so there's a lot of things that the money could be very well spent. And also people with disabilities is another thing that we really need to get into, because a lot of people who have, if a person has even one disability, their chances of falling into poverty, it increases tremendously. I'm sorry, I don't have statistics on the tip of my tongue, but it's really important to remove all those barriers to people who have sometimes just one thing, one disability is keeping them out of the workforce and consigning them to poverty. And so by putting a little effort into getting rid of those, we can bring more of those people into the workforce, and the number of people that are left unable to work are reduced, and therefore it's easier to handle their economic needs. Let's see, we talked about commissions. There are various ideas you can come up with exactly how to form these, but the main thing is it has to be very difficult for any group of vested interest to take over, so that if you had a commission of 16 people, let's say, you don't want them all to be appointed by the mayor, or the city council, because that way they could be taken over. You'd like maybe to have 5 of them be appointed by the 5 major churches in town. Not that they have to appoint somebody from the church, but they get to nominate the person to be on the commission. And maybe if there are a couple of universities in the community, you let each of the presidents of each of the university name somebody to the commission. So that it gets to be hard to just take it over by some local group. Now here's where it really gets interesting. The amount of money, if we take something the same size as Obama's quantitative easing program, it's $3.5 trillion, and you work it out to how much is that per capita, it's $10,975, over $10,000 per capita, every man, woman, child in the country. So when you start apportioning this out to towns, and this is just a list of how it goes, just get your spreadsheet out, it's very simple. It's a huge amount of money. What I will do is I'll circulate this sheet, and if you sign up here on the sheet, I'll send copies of the slides. Maybe just your email is all I need, but I'll send you a copy of these slides. So let's take Detroit. Detroit would get, in this one program, $7.6 billion, basically. And just think about how much healthier Detroit would be if they had a publicly formed commission sitting there trying to figure out how to help the city with their $7.6 billion budget. I think Detroit has about $18 billion in debt, so they couldn't wipe out their debt, but they could certainly, sort of restructure their debt and have money left over to take care of their other pressing needs. I don't know. If you look here at whatever town it is, it's a significant amount of money, and this is just replacing one Wall Street oriented program with one community oriented program. And so this is the kind of thing that a green administration could do simply by changing our priorities. The nice thing about this, from the point of view of campaigning, is that you can go into any city and you can tell them about how much money you think they should have for their democratically community investment program wherever you visit. So for candidates, this is really nice. But wherever you go, you say, I would have you set up a commission, and I would have you figure out how to use whatever the amount of money is. I did it for I live in Lexington, Massachusetts, so we would get $344 million. There are a lot of things we're arguing about now and saying we can't do, but if we had that much money to spend, we would suddenly be able to do them. So anyway, that's the Community Uplift Initiative, and so I guess we have just a few minutes for general discussion. I'll just throw the floor open for what elements of the campaign program have you found useful in your community, and what components do you think the Green Party as a whole should be emphasizing as we go through the next couple of years in terms of programs? So does anybody want to comment on something? Oh, Ruth?
In the scenario that you're describing, where funds are actually going down to towns and communities, where, it said that there's been, dealt with by democratically, the groups who are in charge. I wonder, to what extent, even at that level, can the old boy phenomenon, to what extent can that old boy phenomenon, and I've got friends and everybody feels they're the special ones, not the system kind of thing. And the only thing that occurs to me to counteract that is levels of transparency that I am not aware of being available to just the ordinary person who can go online and look at their town budget and who is in charge of that, and monitor it so they can see where it's going. So, none of it feels valid unless there is an intense amount of attention to transparency.
Yeah, that's right. It has to be utterly transparent. And that's one reason for, first of all, being very careful about who constitutes this commission, because their objectivity as a commissioners is more important. Their freedom from influence is more important probably than their expertise. They have to be people. You don't want a majority to be captured politically, and you want everything to be very public. I mean, what I've seen anyway in Massachusetts.
There's a tension between people who know what they're doing, because you want that as well, but can they parlay that into, other values as well?
Yeah. One thing there may be a role here for some publicly elected people too, to have partners who should be elected publicly appointed. But one thing I've noted in Massachusetts is that for things to be done in secret, that's where the old boy network thrives. When things are not known, nobody knows what's going on. Suddenly they announce a contract that nobody knew was going to be issued. And guess what? The only person prepared to bid on it is our buddy here, the guy who we always give the contracts to. That kind of thing. So you need to eliminate that. And that's the purpose of having the money apportioned with an application that's filled out. It has to have some credibility to it. And then the proper role for the higher levels of government is just to double check that this has been done properly.
I mean, in a way in which the documents you're describing is all right out there. There's just nothing that is kept from the public.
Right.
And I think that is a key component to selling these ideas.
That's right. Yeah. It has to be very, very open way and very fair competitions and then scrutinized at the higher level, so that if you're doing something that doesn't make sense, when you send it in for the federal okay, they can spot it, and send it back and say, you don't have a competitive process, or you haven't justified how this is really going to be a benefit.
Well, I was just going to
gonna say, one thing is opensecrets.org. For national, you can find national in your, like, state, you can find out where they got the money. That's, but I don't know of anything that's like local, other than going to county commission meetings.
I didn't know about them.
Yeah, opensecrets.org, it's really good to look it up, and you can key in their name and see who donated to them. ExxonMobil, Bank of America, you know, and then how much. That's one thing. Then you can go to thomas.gov and see how they voted. But, and then sometimes you can draw the lines right there. But locally, I don't know of anything. Like Florida, we have Sunshine Law. Not that that's always followed. I don't know what you have in your state, but there might be something like a Sunshine Law. The other thing is go to county, like real local, go to county commission meetings or whatever it is, city council meetings or whatever, go to those, and if you're able, and voice your opinions, watchdog, find an issue, watchdog it. Where I live, they have them at like 9 in the morning, so if you're, the only people that can go are, you know, unemployed people, which don't always have transportation to get there, or people that aren't working, you know, like retired, so they have to be our watchdogs, you know, or you have to take a day off work or something, but they, you know, you gotta work for these things.
Is it basis for a club?
Yeah, exactly.
One thing you'll see at the local level is the control of information, talking about transparency, is that's the way they steer things to their friends. They control information. So in Massachusetts, we had a case in every state where, you know, well, we had something that they called it that they had a plan to get rid of surplus property, state surplus property. Okay, and we began to look at this and get more and more suspicious about it, because it was apparent that in many cases what they were doing was some developer would want to get his hands on a piece of property. He would go and talk to the city council, his friends there. They would talk to the legislator, and they would arrange for that piece of property to be declared surplus. And then they would say, it's an open process now, but the thing was, they allowed 30 days for a new plan, 30 days. And so the person who had the inside information that the property was going on the market, they had their architects draw up the plans, they had their proposal, they had their financing ready, and they'd come in with a proposal, I'll buy the property now, I'll put 200 apartments on it. And anybody who wasn't part of the inside network, you know, by the time you found out that the property was available, you know, it was too late almost to bid. So they really steered it to their friends by the control of it. So we labeled that the fast track auction law. And we said it's fast track to the auction block, and it's designed for corruption. And we make a big fuss over it. Statewide, the Green Party did this. Jill Stein was she was running for state reps, so she really got some certainty that way. And eventually, because it was the governor's priority, it was the Speaker of the House's priority, that said they really wanted to rush these surplus properties out with this fast track law. And we raised such a furor. We got all the small towns that we realized what was about to happen to them to weigh in. And they eventually refused to review it. It actually was something on the books that they had passed, and they needed to review it. And they let it die. And we said, why? And they said, well, it was too controversial. It's just too controversial. But it wasn't controversial until we published it. So the main thing is that if things go up and there's, you know, it looks like there's competition because, hey, we're taking bids. But if they control all the information about the bids, there's not really competition. So you obviously have to hear every application has to be done properly, it has to be open. The commission does not have a bunch of guest people sitting on it. It has to have a good number of people who are really concerned about how the money is being spent and how it affects the community. And they have to argue that it really does help the community according to their figures of growth, not just, it's not just a one shot of money or something. It's has some real impact on social values. Any other thoughts or comments? Does anybody? Yeah.
Going back to the original Green New Deal thinking, where the government becomes the employer of last resort and comes up with payments and the wages and so on for all people, how does the Green New Deal address the fact that all can't exponentially increase
I mean, if we're putting aside and addressing issues of population growth, which I think some people have certain political positions and
So what?
others. We're putting aside population growth and how to deal with that, which is some people have various opinions about that. We're talking about the same, that, there are resources being spent on people who are not working and then their families, and looking all these kind of government programs, which came up last night, back to the question. Some candidates may say, let's increase Section 8, let's increase food stamps. These are all means tested programs. So that's like, let's figure out how poor you are, and then we'll see what little hints we give you. That's different than giving everybody some kind of a job. And obviously, the other thing we're talking about in this campaign and others is, where are we getting this money? Obviously, to ramp up renewables and do all this other kind of work is like a massive cut in the military budget. Obviously, changing the whole corporate tax structure in terms of what the corporations and the rich should be paying. So we have to look at how are we generating money to be able to do the other things. It's kind of a big shift where all that money is.
Agreed. So where is that discussed? Because certainly people will have questions about that.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, this all needs to be
Right.
taken care of.
Like, I know that right now, the system has generated, and it's in the works, that over the next 15 years, we're planning to spend up to $1 trillion in revamping our nuclear weapons complex.
Right. Well, under a green government, we wouldn't be doing that. Right. Under a green government, we would not be using the money for that.
Yeah.
We would be using that money for.
A green government that would require a green Congress and as well as a green president.
Look what he said,
I want to say-
3.5 trillion though, right?
Yeah, 3.5 trillion. But
Not
the other thing I want to say is that we view unemployment, a person who's unemployed, as it's like a virulent disease. It's like an epidemic. It's like if we saw somebody who came down with smallpox laying on their sidewalk, suffering, we wouldn't say, well, maybe it's worth responding to this, maybe it isn't. Let's wait a few years and see if maybe it'll go away by itself. I mean, that's the way we talk about unemployment. Oh, well, we'll throw a little bit in, it may help a little bit, but of course it's been there for this community's been suffering it for many years, and it may not help. And we don't even measure very carefully whether our program really made a difference. What we're saying is no. If we go into a community, you go into a black urban community, you find 50% of the young people are unemployed. Young black males, 50% of the demographic is unemployed. That's not acceptable. I mean, it's not something to be tolerated year after year after year while you do these
I'm not
programs.
disagreeing with
So,
any
yeah,
of that.
and what happens is when somebody is not employed, when somebody works, let's say somebody, they're not terribly skilled, they're not an engineer, but they're able to do some work, and let's suppose they can, they can work and they can generate, let's say, $35,000, 35K, I don't think I'm writing very well, but 35K of value, Well, what I mean by value, well, maybe they clean, they wash cars, so they in the term of their year's employment, they're generating $35,000 worth of car washes. Or maybe they nail asphalt shingles onto a roof and they generate value. That's they're unemployed, what a capitalist, in a capitalist system, the capitalist employer looks at that and says, well, let's see, is that, I've got $35,000 and I can hire that person, but could I get a better return on my investment by doing something else for my $35,000? Maybe I could get more return on investment by expanding my factory in China. Maybe I could get more by investing in a hedge fund that pay me better than investing in this human being to do that work and deliver that $35,000. What we're saying is that what we are going to do is we're going to make sure that person goes to work, and when they go to work, they put $35,000 into the economy. Now, what we pay them, a capitalist system, you want to pay them as little as possible. So maybe you pay them $25,000, and they give you $35,000, and you make $10,000 off that employee. But what we're saying is that employment, once we do this, we begin to pour this wealth that would otherwise just not be created because the person would be sitting there unemployed. We begin to pour that into the economy. And so it's not like we're spending. It's not like the person's sitting on their doorstep doing nothing, and we drive by and hand them a check for $35,000, they still sit there and do nothing. They go to work, and when they go to work, they're putting wealth into the economy. So in a sense, it's balanced. It's not like a question of can you afford to give this person $35,000. It's can you afford to lose $35,000 by not having that person stay unemployed all year. So you look at it a little differently. And the other thing is, I think was alluded to by Jennifer and Gloria too, is that when you start getting people off of into jobs and making them working, a lot of the social costs go down. They don't. Maybe they're able to get health care through their employer. Maybe they're able to take care of their family, and a lot of the social problems that otherwise you'd be spending money on begin to recede. They don't cost you as much. So savings are really tremendous. So unemployment is really. It's not something we tolerated. In fact, we can't tolerate it. We can't afford to have these high levels of unemployment. We're wasting too much human capital. We're throwing away all the money and wealth deployed in the economy by putting those unemployed people to work. I mean, unemployment just has to be forbidden. We shouldn't have unemployment any more than we should have an outbreak of scarlet fever. Okay, it eliminate it. And the jobs we can give people. They're not, maybe they're sort of entry-level jobs, but that should be one thing is that people who are unemployed, who have never held a job or have been unemployed for a long time, they need a way to get back in at just an entry level into the market, into the job market. So this would help. And the more people who, not everybody can work. Some people have, problems, handicaps, other problems that keep them from working. But there's a tremendous number of people who are unemployed that really don't have, they have barriers that they can't get over. They have a lack of jobs, but we can get them into the workforce, and it will make the communities, with all those unemployed people, especially urban areas where there's effectively 20 or 25% unemployment in a lot of those areas. If we could knock that down to just a trivial number of people, most of those people working, suddenly the economy would take off. It would really be a boost everywhere. And one thing we've discovered, economists have discovered, is that when you put two people to work, it generates a job for a third person. That's like a subsidiary spinoff, because they're spending money, and so now two people out spending money, suddenly somebody else has to work for that money, and they hire somebody else. So there's like a 50% bonus to all the jobs that you create. So what we're talking about here is we have a number of programs that create private sector jobs, like weatherization. It's not necessarily a public sector job. It may be mostly small little companies. A guy with a van, 6 people, work with it, put insulation in. But every 2 jobs we create that way, we generate another job just here spontaneously. And then if there's still a shortfall, we would have public sector jobs. And those should not be just make work jobs. There are things that public sector jobs that really contribute to the economy. They really deliver this wealth and improve the overall economy. So it's not just welfare. It's putting in things that we really need to get done that don't get done now because so I think when you really do the analysis, eliminating unemployment is a very viable economic system. In fact, it's better than the system we have now, where we spend enormous amounts trying to fix our own social problems. That's the idea.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.